we're absolutely delighted to have Professor David Aldridge here for the talk today on education's theology. It's going to be a really interesting session for today. So thank you very much. And I want to very much thank our own, well, we'll claim you as our own Jerry Dunn, who is also lecturer in Marino Institute of Education, Dr. Jerry Dunn, for putting this webinar together for us. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jerry. And again, apologies from me for the slight delay and for some of the technical glitches. It should be okay now.
Well, thanks a million, Anne, and welcome everyone, and good afternoon to you all. On behalf of the School of Education in Trinity, I suppose I'd like to welcome Professor David Aldridge, who is the head of secondary and further education at Edge Hill University. And David has very eclectic interests in education. He's published in hermeneutics, religious education, ethics, on war, love, literature and education, and phenomenology. And amongst, well, during his spare time, he's co-editor of the British Educational Research Journal, and he's assistant editor at the Journal of Philosophy of Education. At such points, you're tempted to give up and figure and realize that how do these people do it? But congratulations to David, and we are delighted to welcome him here today to talk to us about education's theology. So over to you, Dave, and welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really very pleased to be here and to be trying something out with you. Now, I'm going to try and share something. So one of the co-hosts, if you just cut in if it's not showing what I'm hoping it's showing. If I now display the slideshow, it moves to another screen. Can you see the slideshow now and not my notes screen? I never done that before. I got this wonderful rig now with sort of dozens of different screens. I never know what people can see. That's brilliant. So thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm going to be talking about education theology. And as I say, this is a tentative first outing for this work. But on the other hand, it's not really a first outing because this is something I've been I increasingly realise that includes the stuff that I've published and all the stuff that I haven't got round to publishing for various reasons. And I'm gonna, yeah, so it's tentative. It's definitely very personal. So there's going to be some autobiographical material here, and I'll explain why. But also it's something which is definitely, I mean, I'm sketching out a project here which I can't do on my own. So I'm looking for collaborators, I'm looking for a network, I'm looking for people that can help me out with what I'm trying to get towards methodologically. But I share the autobiographical material because when I've offered papers to Philosophy of Education Society and other forums, and I talk about theology, sometimes I experience the sideways look. And I just want to, let's look at this head on and talk about it. I'm fed up with the sideways look. I am too heathen for the religious education community. I write about religious education quite a lot, but I don't associate with any particular faith tradition. I'm even too heathen for the humanists. I've written about defending humanism in religious education, but I don't associate with British humanism or world humanism. So that I sometimes get sideways looks in the religious education community because it's like, what is your commitment to this? In my book on religious education, I ended up, for various reasons, not particularly defending the discrete space of religious education on the curriculum. I think I had good reasons for that, some of which I'll touch on today, but I get that sideways look. And then in Phil of Ed, when you talk about theology, you sometimes get the sideways look. What's he getting at? So I'll give you some autobiography. One of the reasons for the autobiography, by the way, this is the important slide. If I get through this, you understand the project, and then we can see how far we go. There's plenty here. It gets more and more dense and continental as it goes on, and we'll see how far into that we get. But if I just get through this slide, then I've sketched out, given you an indication of the project. But the autobiography comes, I've had some interesting experiences, and I would say that in certain contexts, talking about theology and philosophy of education, one can scandalize. I was part of a panel in 2015, I think, a keynote panel at the Philosophy of Education Society with David Lewin and Anna Strachan, talking broadly about spiritual approaches to education. And there were definitely some sideways looks then. Where was I going with that? Yes, I've had experiences. I've been scandalized on my own account. So I remember going to the Philosophy of Education Society, the only time I've been to the American Philosophy of Education Society, and I thought I'd found my home there. I went to the Continental Philosophy Special Interest Group. I went to the Spirituality Special Interest Group. It was incidentally all the same people, just moving from one room to the other, of course. But when I went to the Spirituality Special Interest Group, a colleague there said, what do you practice? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, no, what's your spiritual path? Is it yoga? Is it martial arts? And I must admit, I was scandalized at that point. I was like, why am I being asked this? I didn't understand why I was being asked this. But I think other people are sometimes scandalized. So I was giving a paper to a philosophy of education audience on faith schools. A lot of what I was saying I thought was reasonably uncontroversial. So there's quite a popular defense of faith-based schooling that says, well, of course, if we didn't expose young children to the liturgy, they would never, they'd never be interested in the faith. You need that exposure. That might not agree with it. That is often offered as a defense of faith schools. And I said, well, you know, that doesn't sound like a good defense. That makes it sound a bit more like indoctrination than I'd like to think it is. And afterwards, quite a lot of the response I got was, well, but you don't understand it. You do need to experience these things. You do need to experience these things. And you know, you don't understand it because you didn't. So I'm saying it now. so I was raised in an evangelical Christian family. I was very committed to my evangelical faith until I got to university where the faith, I would say, grew old for me. And there's more to say about that. By evangelical, I mean, actually it happens, the church I was at happens to be a Baptist church by tradition, but there was a Baptist church, there was an Elim, there was a Pentecostal where I was part of the demographic of the intake for those. And I would say they were much of a muchness, although we would have insisted there were important differences at the time. You know, so that's out there. That's all the story is really, but the story is out there. So I kind of thought when people were telling me, you know, but if you'd been through this, you'd understand it, because you're outside of it, you don't understand. I thought, well, maybe when I give these talks, I should just say something about what my background is. But I don't think that's particularly important, but it's out there. So in this work, I'm searching for a methodology. I'll look at a historical approach to what I'm trying to get at, but then I'll say this isn't really history. I'm keen to collaborate with historians, but I hope to show why this isn't really history. It's theological interpretation, I think, of a lot of what's in philosophy of education. And I would say methodologically, what I'm offering is a hermeneutical approach. And I'll hopefully say more about that if there's time. So the big thesis is that we need to reckon with theology's, well, what is it? Is it theology's return? Is it theology's homecoming? Is it a turn to theology? Is it a haunting? If it's a haunting, what should our response be to the haunting of educational thought by theology? Should it be an exorcism? I think I end up with something like a Heideggerian idea of destiny. There is a theological destiny of educational thought. I mean that in the Heideggerian sense of a sort of an emerging from a history and a returning. And then I don't have a stance on this. I don't say it should be exercised. I don't say it should be embraced. I simply say it should be reckoned with. But this is on its own interesting for philosophy of education. Continental thinkers reckon with theology all the time. I was actually a classicist at university. I came to philosophy through literary theory, and I learnt my theology from Simon Critchley, John Caputo, Richard Kearney, and theology and continental thought are quite closely aligned. So more continental thinkers in philosophy of education will talk more or less explicitly about God all the time. But in the analytical tradition, perhaps influenced by Hume's, is it a relation of ideas? Is it a sense impression? Then commit it to the flames. I think there is a more awkward relationship. So there can be quite an aggressive response, the commit it to the flames response, or there can be quite a sort of personal, embarrassed privacy. We'll keep theology to one side, even for those who subscribe to those perspectives. I'm talking about theology, talking about Western education, but I'm aware that I perhaps should be bringing in East-West engagements, other accounts of religion. I've done some of that work. So the scandalous panel at Philosophy of Education Society, I was actually making connections between C.S. Lewis's take on the Tao and Heidegger's use of that idea. So I'm aware there is a broader theological range than perhaps I talk about today. Ontotheology has been reckoned with in education, drawing on Heidegger, Derrida. That's not uncommon to read about ontotheology, usually in relation to technological understandings of education. But the theology is there. I'm aware of criticisms that might emerge. So Mohammed Arkoun, I'm using hermeneutics. Mohammed Arkoun has criticised the sort of specifically Christian tenor of much hermeneutical thought and drawn attention to other societies of the book. And then I want to see that maybe we need to broaden this out even further and look at a more ancient pre-Christian form of polytheism, such as you might find in Dreyfus's book, All Things Shining. So that's the scope of things. That's what I'm looking at. And I'm asking, how do we reckon with this? So here you go. Battle Hymn of the Tiger Teachers, fluffed wonderfully by Toby Young there. This is from the chapter by Mr. Smith, who stands on a bench at Michaela School in the playground. Having just, so the story goes, having just ushered a rough sleeper off of the bench. The rough sleeper, of course, is one of the people at the bottom of the pyramid. Outside of Michaela, there is much wailing and gnashing of teeth, of course. And we get this, firstly, excellent timekeeping. This is in Brent, by the way, Michaela School. If you're not aware of Michaela School, I haven't got time to contextualize it. Excellent timekeeping, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot fault you. Well done. That's what makes us Michaela. We take responsibility. We might not want to go to bed early. We might not want to get our clothes ready the night before. We might not want to check that we have all our equipment. We might not want to get up at 6 when it's cold and wet and dark, but we do it. We do it because we are Michaela. We do it because we are top of the pyramid. Do you know what top of the pyramid means? It means that when there are tough choices to be made, we do the right thing. There are millions of people at the bottom of the pyramid, millions. When things are tough, they take the easy choice. When things need perseverance and effort, they take the easy way out. When success isn't instant, they just give up. That's not us. That's not Michaela. We're top of the pyramid. So this is interesting because it has actually, elsewhere in the book, we hear about the Matthew principle, and Michaela is addressing the Matthew principle to those who have, more will be given. But here we have a sense of the narrow gate. Yeah, we walk the straight and narrow path. Many others wouldn't. But I think this is also interesting because why do we walk the narrow gate? There's an interesting circularity which those familiar with Calvinist ideas of predestination and the elect will be familiar with. We walk the narrow path. Why? Because we are Michaela. Yeah. What comes first? Are we Michaela and therefore we walk the narrow path, or are we part of Michaela because we walk the narrow path? It's not entirely clear, and I think we can't escape here from ideas of something like the elect. Moving on now to a historical example, and I'm gonna end up saying this is not the approach I want to take, but it's interesting. So this is John White's work. There is a later book by the name Intelligence, Destiny and Education, but these are ideas that John White has been expressing for a long time, better known for his philosophy of education than his history, but this is his historical recovery work. He says Galton and the other early theorists of IQ, they believe that there are individual differences in general intellectual ability which, like differences in height, have innately determined upper limits. This is an idea which White doesn't spend much time saying is indefensible. Yeah, so it's indefensible. I've looked at the justifications, they're not worth very much. So he then says, when justification for a claim appears inadequate, it's often appropriate to look for an explanation of how the claim came about. At this point, philosophy passes the baton to history. So this is a reason for doing the historical work. How has this idea, which cannot be justified philosophically, taken hold? I'm going to look at history. And it's an idea that he's expressed for a long time. The official doctrine of intelligence is a modern re-edition of the older Puritanism. Nature has replaced God, an elite, the elect, Mensa, the community of the saved, and intelligence testers, the Puritan high priests. It's time we shook such primitive notions out of our minds. He's pretty clear. These are primitive notions, IQ, by extension, the notions that have led to it. All these are at most parallel. So he goes through and he does the work which I'm very much sensitive to. He does the work establishing the similarities between the idea of IQ and the Puritan and Calvinist intellectual tradition. But then he says, look, these are just echoes across the centuries. Now I've got a lot more time for echoes across the centuries than John White appears to have. These are just echoes across the centuries, which may or may not be coincidental. Where I want to go is to say, look, these echoes are in the language. There is a methodology here which will let us do that work. But White, perhaps because of his commitment more to an analytical than to a continental tradition, which would quite happily embrace those echoes across the centuries and talk more confidently about them, feels that he needs to do a little bit of historical detective work. It's interesting, but I don't think this is the way to go. So he then goes through the early theorists of IQ and shows how they had family backgrounds in Puritanism. I can't speak for the quality of the history being done there. I find it very interesting, but I find it not to be essential. Yeah, it's not important to me that they had family connections with Puritanism. These echoes are already there. They're in the language. So I want to say that's interesting. I want to talk about the echoes. I don't feel the need to take the historical path that White does there. So I argue that I take a hermeneutical path at this point. Hermeneutics is fun because it's got divinity built in. Yeah, Hermes brings messages, crosses the gap between the gods and humans. So you could say, and I'm going to argue this more strongly, that hermeneutics leaves a theological footprint wherever it treads. Now, this could be, if I was presenting this talk differently, this could be the punchline. Yeah, even my methodology is haunted theologically. I didn't want to save it. So you've got the punchline now. I'm accepting that up front, that even the methodological approach I want to take has that haunting built in. Now, this could be over convenient. I mean, hermeneutics has been quite closely associated with scriptural interpretation, but it clearly predates that. And what have I got in my notes? Yeah, where Jensen says hermeneutical reflection began when the old myths about the gods didn't make sense anymore. What might be more important was the fact that the myths were old than they were about the gods. So I don't want to labor, a theological origin to hermeneutics all the way back, but theology is definitely there in Gadamer, and Gadamer and Heidegger are my key sources for the kind of philosophical hermeneutics that I want to do. I haven't got time to tell the whole story. Anthony Thistleton gives a nice account here of sort of where Gadamer sits in the in the tradition of textual interpretation. Of course, Gadamer doesn't make a big thing about theological hermeneutics in his work. But there are ideas that he expresses in philosophical hermeneutics that are radical when you apply them to any other text than the Bible. When you apply them to the Bible, you can see that they were there in the tradition all the time. So Gadamer has been called the secular Luther. Key to his philosophical hermeneutics are these claims. The text is a source of truth, not a startling claim to be made by a Christian about the Bible. It has transformative potential, it can change your life, and it has a living meaning. Its message can be made new by interpreters in different ages and situations. Radical claims about all books, less radical in relation to where the book stands in the Christian tradition. And of course, not just the book. This is Arkun's point, not just the Christian tradition. There are other societies of the book. Arkun's got the idea of the lever, capital L, little l, the book, where he talks about those societies whose relationship with books have been structured by their relationship with the book. And I think when we're looking at hermeneutics and its textual connotations, we can't escape the fact that that has been to an extent configured by a relationship with the book. I can develop that more in the questions if we have time. So hermeneutics is nice because the hermeneutical relationship, I've argued this in my work, looks quite a lot like the traditional instructional triangle. In the hermeneutical relationship, the student here can be the reader, the teacher is the text. Very important for Gadamer that one approaches a text as if it has something to teach you, and then the subject matter emerges in the exchange. It looks quite a lot like the instructional triangle, or what Paul Standish has playfully, not so playfully, called the sacred triangle. So that's in his Impudent Practices. Here's an interesting bit of autobiography, because we're going to talk about how Standish talks about religion in relation to exposure and scandal. Paul Standish enjoys the idea that he scandalizes, and this leads him to sometimes remember having scandalized audiences, which he quite clearly hasn't. So in this text, Impudent Practices, he talks about when he presented his diagram to the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, and it scandalized the room. How can you present this diagram to us? That's not how you do philosophy. I was in the room. I'd just given a paper on a very similar thing. So I remember I had my hand up to say, oh, look, I've got a triangle as well. Standish introduced his diagram. He said, I know this will scandalize. I've presented it before and it scandalized everybody. It didn't scandalize the room. I was there. There were lots of interesting questions about it, but it's very important. It's there in Impudent Practices. This scandalized the room. We move on to scandal. This is in Standish's Boyd lecture, Teaching Exposed, Education in Denial. Standish talks about embracing the sense of scandal. Any expectation prompted by my title, Teaching Exposed, that this lecture would be a tale of scandal, of the iniquities of teachers, of cover-ups by boards of education, of corruption on the campus, will by now have been sadly disappointed. Yet I do want to sound a note of scandal here. We can speak of being scandalized by, for example, the growing inequalities of wealth in the world, or by failures in government responses to the spread of the Ebola virus, where there may be good reason for such reactions. But the sense of scandal is more typically characterized by the feeling that there has been an offense to propriety, to correct forms of behavior and received ideas. Ray Elliott, he says, at that time, editor of the Journal of Philosophy of Education, suggested to me that it was important to bring out the stifled sense of scandal that my thoughts provoked in some of my audience. I would say Standish has taken that duty very seriously. In other words, that this related to a certain philosophical propriety in the thoughts of my critics. Now I'm going to talk about the theological content of Standish's work, which I think he's drawing on continental sources. He barely conceals, but he does approach obliquely. He doesn't approach it in an impudent way. Some might argue I'm doing now, but you can look at his paper on education without aims, for example. God moves throughout this paper, but is always approached obliquely, out of the corner of one's eye, never head on. But he's there. Much the same could be said in relation to the erotic in that paper and in other papers that Standish writes about. There's a whole set of outtakes from my Education's Love Triangle paper, which dealt with Standish on the erotic, which are probably another paper for another time. Previous to this point, Standish has said of education, one way to articulate the specialness is to say that it has a priestly nature. There's the triangle of teacher-learner content as the holy ground in this paper. In the complex historical intertwining of education and religion, the idea of holy ground is not without its problems. It's said that one professes a faith, so where does the teacher's faith lie? These are just outtakes from Standish's Boyd lecture. Bearing witness, the teacher bears witness. I find myself uneasy in part with what is said here, so I think we should adopt a via negativa. Yeah, the theological threads are, as I say, barely concealed, and I think are at least part of what Standish intends to draw attention to when he talks about exposure. So I'm moving now to approaches to education, which I think quite explicitly draw out its theology. And I'm looking at education in the broadest sense. So one of the colleagues now that I want to talk about, I'll get onto him in the next slide, is Gert Biester. I've worked very closely with Gert at Brunel. Obviously, we co-edit the British Educational Research Journal together. We've written on religious education together. We've done work on religious literacy. And increasingly, Gert is working on religious education together with Pat Hannam. Has just published a book on religion and education, RE's Forgotten Dimensions. So he's paying a lot of attention to RE. But before he was paying a lot of attention to RE, he was paying a lot of attention to theology. This has been, by the way, this is I Fear Theologians Bearing Gifts, a little reworking of Virgil there. I don't fear those theologians, but I think sometimes there is more reason for religious education practitioners to fear Biester's embracing of theology than they perhaps think there is. What could be more hospitable, you might think, to religious education than someone who is drawing out, someone who quite explicitly talks about education as revelation, as transcendence, wants to talk about the other, but it can't just be outside of the self, it needs to be wholly other. What could be more hospitable to religious education than someone thinking in this way? Well, of course, the danger for religious education is that all of this discussion is being had around education. It's being had around the curriculum, and doesn't therefore provide a justification for discrete space for religious education. Actually, if the whole of the curriculum is theologically inflected, that weakens the case for discrete curriculum time for religious education. I haven't got much time to develop that now. We can pick that up in the questions if you want. But I'm going to talk more about Biester's theology. So transcendence is vital. So I started on this path because Biester goes very hard against hermeneutics, and this offends my scholarly nature because I would like to promote hermeneutics quite a lot. If you read the robot vacuum cleaners paper, if you read the rediscovery of teaching, my interpretation is that Biester isn't attacking philosophical hermeneutics any more than when he attacks learnification, he's attacking learning. You can read Biester's books. He uses the word learning, quite ordinary sense, throughout them. So, you know, he attacks learnification. You might think he's anti-learning. He's not. He attacks hermeneutics. He gives it a very particular meaning here. I don't think he is anti-hermeneutics. I think the scandalous claim appeals to him. I think actually the work he's doing in this paper is within philosophical hermeneutics. The target he has in mind, I would say, is an impoverished hermeneutics, which is also the kind of target that Gadamer might have in mind. You know, a preoccupation with education as concerned with meaning, as concerned with you know, narrowly bounded propositional content. These would be impoverished accounts of the moment of understanding. Similarly, Gert says education isn't all about understanding, it's about transcending understanding. Of course, there's another way that you can read the Levinas that he uses here, the transcendence of understanding. We might be transcending understanding, or we might be talking about the transcendence that is understanding, or the transcendent movement of understanding. And this is where it gets quite technical, and I'll pass through it quite quickly, but I think it is quite important, because I think the differences that I might have with Biester here are not hermeneutical ones. You could quite easily, as in fact Levinas does. Levinas doesn't reject hermeneutics. When Levinas critiques Gadamer or Heidegger, this is happening within a hermeneutical tradition, I think. Our differences, if we have them, are theological, yeah, because Gadamer and Levinas differ on the issue of revelation. Both of them talk about transcendence in the movement of understanding. But Levinas's transcendence begins explicitly from a discussion of the possibility of a divine revelation. The question which he starts with is an unabashedly theological one. In the paper that Gert discusses, he says, how can these truths and signs strike our reason if they are not even of this world? It begins with something, how do we encounter something out of this world? Gadamer, I would say, is more profane about transcendence. Yeah, the world itself for Gadamer is in the circle. Now, I don't want to get too far into this difference around transcendence, but I'm perhaps giving an indication of where we would need to go if we want to grapple with education's theology. We begin to move into these theological differences within our educational understanding. I think Gert's claim that education means being responsive to an other can be made within a Gadamerian theology, which doesn't require a radical interruption from outside the natural order. It simply requires an other to me. Whereas for Gert, Gadamer, I think, is not sufficiently transcendent. I haven't got much more time to develop that, but maybe we can do that in the questions. So the last thing I want to say is that, of course, there are different theological ways of reading transcendence. And in my hermeneutics book, I look at Vatimo's account of transcendence, where the sacred is overcome. And this is what makes possible for Vatimo his claim now that I believe that I believe. Yeah, that's the kind of religious claim that we can now make. So he starts with his Christology emerging from God is dead philosophy. Since God can no longer be upheld as an ultimate foundation, it is possible once again to believe in God. It's not the God of metaphysics or of medieval scholasticism, but that is not the God of the Bible, he says. Sorry, let me back. I have begun to take Christianity seriously again, Gianni Vatimo says, because I have constructed a philosophy inspired by Nietzsche and Heidegger. This is the best brief example I can give of the idea of the destiny of education's theology. And I've interpreted my experience in the contemporary world in light of Nietzsche and Heidegger. Yet in all probability, I constructed my philosophy with a preference for these authors, precisely because I started with the Christian inheritance, which I have now found again, though in reality, I had never abandoned it. And then in a final twist, Vatimo can interpret the destiny of secularization as being prefigured in the Christian message, so that nihilism itself becomes the meaning of the message of incarnation. He acknowledges the influence of René Girard. He writes that Christ shows that the sacred is violence and opens the way to a new human history that can be called secularized. And this entails for Vatimo a rejection of the transcendent principle of natural religion. So just the last bit, I said this, I've given an indication, I hope, that one way of reckoning with education's theology might be to acknowledge that these theological debates have their counterpart in philosophical educational debates. And I read now a lot of my previous writing, echoing that kind of destiny idea, as in fact grappling with these debates. So one of the philosophers of education who's been most influential on me, it's perhaps the philosopher of education I would most like to write like, if I had anything like the capacity, is Porrick Hogan. Obviously, Hogan has done some of this work in the custody and courtship of experience, offered those two different accounts of education, the theological account, or let's say the Christian account, and the Socratic account. When I've written about Hogan, I've tended to take issue with him. So I've written a paper on three epiphanic fragments where I take issue with Hogan's presentation of the Epiphany. In my Education's Love Triangle paper, I take issue with Hogan's preference for agapeic love over erotic love. And I wonder if what's been working through my published work so far has been that antagonism between the sacred and the profane that I can kind of see in what's at issue maybe with between myself and Bista around the nature of the transcendence that is core to education. In my Epiphany paper, definitely I'm taking a Nietzschean stance there. I'm rejecting the radical epiphany. I largely end up saying, how could anything originate out of its opposite? That is one approach to the theological idea of the epiphany. Others are available. I'm going to stop there and take questions. Thank you. Can't hear you, Anne.
It's work.
Yep.
I'm having a technical nightmare day. Sorry about that. So thanks so much, David, for a really interesting, very broad, encompassing talk there today. And Jerry, do you want to? I thought I just invite the people who are here as attendees to use the chat. Use the chat function to put in your questions. I think, Jerry, might you have some questions of your own, perhaps, having considered this? I'm just going to give people a little bit of an opportunity just to type in things that they were looking to ask.
Good product placement there, David. Yeah, I suppose I would need time to digest. There's quite a lot in what Dave has presented. I'm interested in not just the hermeneutic angle, but the language that we ascribe to theology in the round. So, and its historical development. So language like virtue, which we can obviously trace to Aristotle and people like that, but has a religious meaning for so many. How do we escape the hermeneutic triangle when it comes to identifying what language is for us? Or can we generalize in any shape or form what language is for us and for others?
So, I mean, two things I want to come back on there as I think about it. I should have said something about character education. You know, this is why it's good to do these things. Of course, yeah. I need to pull that. Something also largely unpublished, but something also that I've thought about a lot. And character education has been caught up educationally with with matters of faith. You know, it's there in the Jubilee Centre. So there's something interesting there. Yeah, is it possible to talk about virtue in education in ways that aren't entirely haunted by that Christian tradition? You know, the Christian reception of Aristotle. So that's a question, answering a question with a question. You know, I'm keen to get other people's ideas about what the methodological approach needs to be, and I think that is one of the questions that I'm asking. You know, and virtue is a great example. You know, can we think about virtue in education? Ought we to be trying to think about virtue in education in ways that haven't been conditioned? Literacy is the other one, which I sort of promised in my abstract and haven't talked very much about. You know, are we capable of thinking about literacy outside of that theological story, which it seemed to me when I was doing the work with Sean as well, Pat Hannam, Gert Biester and Sean Whittle, it seemed to me that this was a theological story. And when you're reckoning with the history of literacy as an idea, it's an inescapably theological idea.
That's really interesting. I'd never really, sorry, from the point of the literacy question, and it's possibly, I suppose, an explanation for why literacy remains so dominant in our systems. I always find it very frustrating that you can't escape it. Like if somebody is, maybe hasn't the best literacy skills, there's very little escape from that in our education systems, because they're very focused on literacy. And I had been thinking of it in terms of capturing, it's a good way to capture knowledge or whatever, in the way, or to record, and maybe, that's a reason, but that other dimension, that, the power of the word and the written word and all, I hadn't really considered it. It's a very interesting notion.
Right, and Mohammed Arkoun has been influential on me here with his claim that there are cultures, maybe not all cultures, but there are cultures that whose entire relationship with the book has been established and is haunted by that relationship with the one book, which of course had these this redemptive potential.
Interesting. Dave, there's a question here. What's your working definition of theology? It seems to be used quite widely, but the authors used are rather more precisely located.
Yeah, so I accept that. I am using it quite widely, and this is because I think I'm in search of a methodology for the work that I want to do. Interesting that the authors are precisely located. Yes, they are. I know who I want to write about, and I know how I'm connecting them. But yeah, what can I be more precise about my definition of theology? Well, I think when I get that, I've got the whole arc. I mean, to a certain extent, if I'm talking about Western education, I can be thinking of, Western monotheistic Christian tradition, and there's a piece of work to be done there, and within that theology, there is of course plenty of contestation and debate, which is the kind of contestation and debate that I want to be having. But I'm aware that I should broaden this out more. And so, I find tantalizing Dreyfus's Heideggerian approach. He takes us back to dwelling among the gods and the mortals, and talks about what maybe it doesn't make sense to call it a theology, but talks about what a shining divinity might have been prior to that monotheistic turn. And I think I want to be open to drawing that into my account.
I'm not sure if I was thinking about it as I went through. Where is the place for atheism in the discussion?
Yeah. So I mean, I talked about Vatimo believing that he believes. I mentioned Richard Kearney. What does Richard Kearney talk about? Anatheology, this kind of returning of theology, which only and what one can bring in, the post-secular turn, the Christian non-realist /theism. Sometimes it seems too easy, but one of the moves that you might make here is that this is kind of theological wherever you stand. So, or the post-secular move is to say that the atheism and theism, that distinction is less compelling after the death of God, the end of metaphysics, wherever you want to place it. So atheism is there, but the theology is in the educational thought regardless.
Hmm. There's a question here. Do you want to read that there, Jerry?
Yeah.
I can see.
Great talk, Professor David. Could you kindly elaborate more about North-South engagement? Do you think hermeneutics are faith-specific and based on cultural relativism, or there could be a universal methodological approaches to understanding the discourse of hermeneutics?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Gadamer wants to say that that hermeneutics is the universal philosophical question. Yeah, but Mohammed Arkoun, reading Gadamer, talking about philosophical hermeneutics, says this isn't even just monotheistic, this is Christian. And Arkoun wants to open out hermeneutics beyond that Christian tradition. So I'm just aware. Once it's pointed out to me, I can't escape the idea of Gadamer as the secular Luther. So I think, whilst hermeneutics remains my frame, I'm open to the possibility that it is inescapably structured by Christian theological approaches to revelation, and that if you like, that is my that is my methodological getting it all out there in terms of methodology. So once that's all out there, we can look at the argument and assess it on those grounds. I notice there's one from Amanda in the chat as well. I got one from David Lundy. Let's do David's.
Yeah.
Standish's triangle lacking incarnation. Putting the text at the top seems theological.
Will I read that while you're considering it?
Yeah, could you? Yes.
Yeah. So, is Standish's triangle lacking an incarnational theology? I can see how, on an intuitive level, putting the text, i.e. curriculum content, at the top, as in a Platonic or divine ideal, seems theological. For theologians like Augustine, who wrote about pedagogy, however, there was an incarnational aspect. The inner man is Christ, and education is about drawing this truth out and forming it. In some ways, it's much more pupil-centered than text-centered. There are incarnational and pneumatological dimensions to Christian theology, which complicate the picture. I could say more about how incarnation and the scandal of the crucifixion challenge the simple text down picture from Standish, but we'll stop.
Yeah, so fair enough. Although I'm aware that as Standish presents it, I'm already overlaying my own configuration of the hermeneutical relationship. So Standish tends to leave it there or allude to it. Sometimes he talks about one of the sides of the relationship, but he hasn't really unpacked that as a textual relationship, for example. So there's a few things I want to say in response to David. One of the things I want to say is that even in Gadamer, so there's the criticism of Gadamer that this is a textual model and perhaps it shouldn't be. I don't think Gadamer privileges text as the model for that hermeneutical relationship. I think dialogue is probably a more primary, is more the primary model, so that one's relationship with text even is a dialogue. And as you unpack that seems quite strange, but he's quite clear about that. One approaches the text as a teacher, and of course it's not content which emerges in the Gadamerian configuration, it's subject matter, it's the thing at issue, as it is in Heidegger, die Sache, the thing which is at issue, which emerges. So I would say even in the Gadamerian picture, this is a dialogic meeting, but it doesn't need to be a dialogic meeting between persons. It can be a dialogic meeting with a text, or it can be an encounter with the natural world. So you, David, you might have issues with my picture. There is the sort of lingering textuality. Sean Gallagher gives an interpretation of the triangle, and says that actually the sort of dominant model in hermeneutics is education. Hermeneutics is primarily educational, even before it's dialogic, which is quite interesting. And there's fun to be had there, because one can look at theological stories, theodicies, responses to the problem of evil, which privilege education. So there's also theology's education, which we haven't talked about, but which is part of this story. So if you're taking issue, what you might be taking issue with might be my hermeneutical triangle. I'm wary of attributing too much of what you're attacking there to Standish, because, as I say, he tends to just sort of offer you the triangle and leave it there.
There's a question here from Amanda Fulford. Yeah. Amanda, I'm just going to click here to see if you want to put the question yourself. So you can take yourself off mute there if you want to ask the question yourself.
Okay, thanks, David. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
I can.
Yeah, thank you. David, that was absolutely fascinating, and I'd really love to collaborate on you. I think from what you were saying earlier on, we share perhaps a very similar background that perhaps we didn't realise. So yeah, I'd really appreciate talking to you further. But just as you were talking, I'm thinking, is there something here about education's practices and a kind of strain of the theological kind of running through that really fully and really richly? So I'm thinking, we talk about, students being on this journey, and education as a journey towards some kind of sacred goal, whatever that sacred goal is. And of course, we have lots of them. And it seems to remind me of kind of pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And some of those aspects of pilgrimage, such as, the kind of daily ritual of it, because it takes time. And it takes effort, and this kind of self-sacrifice along the way, and this kind of embodied experience. So, I think there's something rich potentially about pilgrimage here that I wondered if you thought was interesting and worth pursuing.
Yeah. So I've had a student. Well, I had a student at Brunel prior to moving, John Perkins, who's working on progress. He's working on ideas of progress, and looking at the Michaela claims that I shared at the start, I said to him, we've got to be reading Pilgrim's Progress. You're absolutely right. The progress and the idea of a pilgrimage are really quite close. Again, for good or for bad. And I hope I was sufficiently clear in my presentation of the Michaela story that I think this can be for bad. I'm happy to be quite explicit about that. But yes. Yeah, absolutely. The idea of pilgrimage, the monastic life, connections between the monastic life and the structuring of time in the school curriculum. Definitely, it's worth exploring. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
There's one last question here from another attendee about, in light of your methodological concern, would you find phenomenology congenial? It seems to be not a million miles from the hermeneutical turn.
Yeah. So my hermeneutical approach is phenomenological hermeneutics. Yeah. And when I wrote my book about a hermeneutics of religious education, I could quite easily have called it a phenomenology of religious education, except that would have opened up a whole can of worms, because in RE, phenomenology means something via Ninian Smart, which has very little to do with what you're suggesting here. But yeah, I would say that is what I'm trying to do. That I'm coming at this very much from a phenomenological perspective. Yeah. And yes, whilst also anchoring a not necessarily theological grammar of transcendence. Yeah. I buy that. Yeah, so there's the Heideggerian originary transcendence, there's Gadamer's transcendence, and then there is, that to me is the debate that I see in education. Heidegger, Gadamer, Levinas. That's what's at work in Biester's critique, in the rediscovery of teaching. That's at work in his critique of hermeneutics. Yeah.
Thanks so much, David. I might pass to Jerry here to say a couple of, or to yourself also, to say a couple of closing words. I've got a lot to be going away to think about anyway, so I might just pass to Jerry.
Thanks, Anne. As do I. David, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. I had a further question myself, but I'll pose it to you offline. I keep thinking of vocation and teaching being painted as a vocation and that type of language as well. But very much enjoyed the talk. Thank you for addressing us here today. And I'll pass over to Anne then to do the final honors.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so Professor David Aldridge, delighted to have had the opportunity to hear this discussion today. And it was great to have so many interesting questions coming from the audience also. We really appreciate it. We hope at some point to see it in person. You never know.
That would be nice. Yeah.
Although
I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, no, it is wonderful online where we can have people join us from where, you know, from around the place where we don't all have to come together in a room, but it will be nice to come together in a room in the future. But in any case, thank you very much, Professor Aldridge. We look forward to talking to you again in the future, and many thanks to our audience for joining us this evening, and best evening to you.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.